Hello, and thank you for tuning in to a conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nasim Ahmed, and I will be your host for today's discussion. In this episode, I am joined by Palestinian American academic Karam Dana to discuss his new book, To Stand with Palestine: Transnational Resistance and Political Evolution in the United States. Karam is the Alison McGregor Distinguished Professor of Excellence and Transformative Research at the University of Washington Bothell, and amongst other things, of course. Karam, thank you for joining us. Real pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So, Karam, this conversation is part of MEMO's build-up to the annual Palestine Book Awards, which will take place in November this year, in a few months' time. So I will be interviewing authors and publishers of books entered for the 2025 PBA, and I'm delighted to say you're the first book I am reviewing with you. So it's a real pleasure, as I mentioned. But before we dive into some of the key themes and arguments in your book, can you just roughly sketch out what it's about and what are you trying to do with the book?
Yes, the book has been kind of in the making for about 8 years, and it really addresses what I have noticed as a Palestinian American myself in the United States. I've noticed some sort of a transformation in terms of how Palestine has been viewed and talked about and discussed in the public sphere. And largely defined, and by that I mean it's quite the difference from, when I first noticed how Palestine and Palestinians are talked about in such a negative sense in the early 2000s, in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But that about a decade or so after that, I noticed that there's a transformation, there's a change. And I kind of went into a quest effectively. I went on a quest to kind of figure out multiple things. The first has to do with why is it that Palestine and Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims have been thought of and talked about in such a negative way? And of course, the simple answer is Orientalism, obviously. But I wanted to dig deeper into that. I wanted to kind of like to figure out the nuance and the little pieces of it that create kind of an image that is rather negative, specifically for Palestinians, that is somewhat distinct from, say, other Arab Americans or Arabs from other Arab countries or Muslims from other parts of Muslim majority countries. So that was one part. But then the second is also noticing this transformation. So I had to explore the first part in order for me to fully understand the second part and look into the reasons as to why that change is happening. And effectively, more or less, in a nutshell, the book is about the fact that there's more sympathies towards Palestinians in more recent years in the United States. And that has to do with specific structural transformations that are taking place in American society, socioeconomic and political and technological, obviously. And in a sense, a lot of it can come to mind, from the get-go. You'd be like, oh yeah, okay, well, I understand that social media is important, but social media is not the only piece to this. But I also understand, in a sense, that there have always been pro-Palestinian voices speaking on behalf of Palestinians. But why now, and why are those numbers increasing? So I provide an answer to that. I provide kind of a holistic answer to this. And as I said, it took 8 years for me to kind of finish the book effectively, because it's, an idea starts growing and it takes you in different directions, and the ramifications of that idea and how do you actually put them all together was quite I don't want to call it a challenge. It was more of an adventure, but also a very emotional adventure for me as a Palestinian who was born and raised in Al Khalil, in Hebron, Palestine, the West Bank, and having migrated to the United States in the late 1990s. It was quite astonishing to me how people knew very little or nothing, or have had misconceived notions about Palestine and Palestinians in such a negative way. For me to notice that that transformation is taking place in my own lifetime, and kind of more or less effectively to see that there's a trajectory in terms of how people see ideas and how ideas are transforming in people's minds. To me, that's quite interesting, and I've noticed that I feel quite privileged to be able to write the book.
Mm. We will get to some of the reasons you cite for why you think this transformation has taken place. But if I can go back to something you mentioned earlier, some of the emotional reasons why you embarked on this journey, I guess. So you also mentioned you're from Khalil. So what are the key milestones, or are there key moments from your visits to Palestine that sparked this, quest? I mean, I know we've been in the UK most of my life, having visited Bangladesh in 2000 when I was about 16, many, many years back. That
Mhm,
was a transformative moment for me,
mhm,
being in the UK all my life and then going to another country and seeing um, the lifestyle of your family and your cousins and
mhm,
the poverty which they live in and the opportunities you have. Of course, you'll be considerably different in the sense that you're from a country that's occupied,
mhm,
and Hebron, which is one of the most, I would say, oppressed and racist towns in the whole of Palestine. So are there key moments in that journey from your visits to Hebron and other parts of Palestine which sparked that journey?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I totally agree with you that in terms of there are moments where you come with reality and kind of like realize that there's something quite interesting about the image or the situation that
Mm,
you're in, and I think it's slightly different in my case because I'm actually from the obvious you mentioned, I'm from Hebron Khalil. And I have been going quite regularly since I moved to the US. I have visited quite a lot. I've done research in Palestine and the West Bank. So I've had a regular kind of interactions with Palestinian society. I've done public opinion surveys in Palestine and the West Bank, and interviews and so on. So my point is, I'm connected, if that makes sense. I'm connected to
mm,
the pulse of the Palestinian society because I, by virtue, not only by virtue of being Palestinian, but I also research Palestine. So I'm connected to what is happening. That's the first part. The second is that I also in terms of Palestine itself, I mean, I notice it, if I may, the juxtaposition effectively of what it means to be living in quote unquote Western society in Western countries and being from that part of the world, in terms of like that there's that perceived incompatibility of my identity, my very existence as Palestinian in American societies, that space, this space that I quote unquote live in, um, is not one that is hospitable to me, but also it is assuming that I'm not part of the society effectively. So that was one part that I mean, since day one, I've always noticed that. Now, in terms of visiting, I mean, there's something interesting about my own town, as you've mentioned, is that it is it is an oppressed city. It is a city that is divided. It is a city that is tortured. It is a city that has gone through layers and layers of really oppressive Israeli occupational policies that uh, disconnect people from one another, disconnect people from their own homes, and really create what the interesting thing is that like if you are to experience the highest levels of occupation and apartheid, Hebron is the city for that. Al Khalil is the place where you see it most visibly, effectively. So to me, being able to live in these spaces, being an American citizen, living in the United States, these perceived liberties and freedoms and so on the one hand, and the idea that you can the idea, at least the perceived idea that the individual is valuable. Once you go to the West Bank, to Palestine, and having to cross checkpoints and having to be, humiliated effectively because this is the structure that exists there, because you happen to be Palestinian, it's quite astonishing. And to me, in terms of, you know, it is quite interesting. There's this very interesting conversation that almost every Palestinian has had with someone who's a non-Palestinian in the U.S. When asked, "Where are you originally from?" people you would say, I'm from Palestine," and the immediate reaction is oftentimes is that you Pakistan. I've heard of Pakistan. You're like, wait, it is not Pakistan. It's Palestine. So effectively, this very simple interaction, which is rather typical. I mean, it's a very typical kind of more or less cliche type of an interaction. It really highlights how American society sees Arabs, Palestinians, and Muslims. They all see them through the same lens. and they're orientalized effectively. They're ideas that are deeply rooted in terms of how a larger American society sees the region effectively. Again, it's the Orientalism that is in action that has been ongoing for decades, obviously. But I think if we're talking about specific moments, if I may, um, I think um, the in the late 1990s, there was this event, the WTO event in Seattle, in Seattle, Washington. And the World Trade Organization representatives from around the world were meeting, and there was a protest. There was a counter protest to those efforts. And I was in that protest, and I was watching this. And a lot of, I mean, the vast majority of people were just holding signs and speaking about the importance of having fair trade rather than free trade, quote unquote, right? To provide more social justice-based approaches to conducting trade around the world, but then also like obviously environmental and all other issues associated with free trade. And what I saw that day, I think it kind of that moment, and I was a very very young man then. It really set me on the same journey that I'm on today, which is to what I witnessed that day, where the police violently attacking protesters, which in my mind kind of shattered any doubt that there is a major difference oftentimes between how states in democratic societies operate or oppressive societies operate. When it comes down to it, is that the state has the monopoly over power and legitimate forms of power, and the state will use all tools at its own disposal. Sorry, all tools at its own disposal to crush any form of dissent. And to me, that really kind of freed me, if I may. There was a moment of freedom at that moment that allowed me to start thinking about the differences that exist in the US society and the injustice that exists in the US society. And I was able to easily kind of compare my own experience as a Palestinian growing up until my late teenage years in Palestine under Israeli occupation. I was able to see those parallels quite easily and quite clearly. So I think these are the things, is that being able to witness things that happened in the United States, things that happened in Palestine, in the West Bank, in Khalil, in my town, and understanding the general condition of Palestinians living under Israeli occupation and oppression, but also recognizing that there's also in the United States, there are BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the United States that have experienced similar, if not and then continuous, similar types of forms of oppression. So to me, that allowed me to, kind of go on the journey of thinking about society, if I may. And I think I feel
Yeah.
anything, my personal, I feel contribution is that I present society as a very complex thing, right? But I also that there are
Yeah,
things
I
over
think
time. Yeah.
some of those things we want to get to later on. But before, I mean, your book, I mean, when I read it, it's quite optimistic book. And given the situation we're in, it's a really bleak situation with the genocide in Gaza. You present a vision of a future where American public is becoming too aware of the Palestinian cause, and no one is ever going to ask you anymore, is Palestine Pakistan? I think this is probably 30 years ago, and that we have seen a massive shift in American public opinion, especially since over the last 21 months during the Gaza genocide. And it's not just the Democratic Party, it's the Republican voters as well. Their base has also realize the sway Israel has on American politics, and there's a turning point I think we've reached, and I think you try and unpack some of the underlying causes and the reasons for that turning point. So maybe let's begin with unpacking that. One of the things you identify as being a key factor in swaying or having an influence on US public opinion uh, towards Palestine is the Palestinians themselves, the Palestinians in the diaspora. And you describe them as a massive, huge, influential source of power for why the Palestinian cause has gone from being unrecognizable in the 80s and 90s in the eyes of an American average person to now being the front headline news all over the
goodness.
place. So yeah, so speaking about that, some of the
Sure.
why the diaspora community has been so influential, what is their composition and makeup, and how has that accelerated um, the Palestine awareness of the Palestinian struggle in the US. And of course, the same story can be said about the
Other
West
perspective.
generally as well, in the
Yep.
UK and other parts of Europe.
Absolutely. No, I think so. So the interesting thing about Palestinians in general, or Palestine as a cause, as a kind of a struggle, is that in 1948, obviously, the Nakba, the still ongoing kind of a process of dispossession, Palestinians living around the world, it was meant to destroy Palestinian society. It was meant to fragment Palestinian society and dismember Palestinian society. And to an extent, it succeeded at that particular moment. But what ended up happening is that those little Palestinian communities that were scattered around the world, obviously, a lot of those Palestinian refugees were in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, but also outside the mandatory Palestine, in Arabic speaking countries in the region, but also well beyond that. So effectively, this community around the world is now third or potentially fourth generation down the road, having lived with deep roots in these communities, in these societies, able to understand the socioeconomic and political landscape of the places in which they resided, and understanding the politics of that region, those different countries, if I may. So a lot of them even run for office in these places, are able to engage in the local politics to a level that their parents and grandparents were never able to kind of pursue effectively. So that was the first part. But then the other piece to this is that Palestinians in Palestine after the Second Intifada kind of issued a renewed call for solidarity around the world with around 2005, a group of civil society leaders came together, recognizing the levels of violence that are taking place in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and inside 1948 Palestine, against Palestinians during the Second Intifada, recognizing that this traditional type of a struggle is not going to really be fruitful effectively, especially after 9/11, right? In terms of how the securitization of the Western world looks like, and it really comes at the expense of racializing and dehumanization of people like Palestinians. So the call for global solidarity, renewed global solidarity, through what is known as the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions call in 2005, asking all people of conscience to kind of exert pressure on on Israel due to its policies against Palestinians. And I think the two together, effectively BDS and the global Palestinian diaspora that has lived everywhere, again, third, fourth generation in different societies, including the United States, the two effectively started speaking to one another, not necessarily literally, but figuratively, effectively. They started addressing the issue in a new way. And this is why, for example, BDS has a life of its own, and it's really has grown and become a very powerful campaign and social movement that really has targeted Israel and to varying levels of success. So the Palestinian condition, effectively, now has become not only one that lives under Israeli occupation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip that is geography bound, but one that has over decades has become transnational, effectively, living in transnational spaces and understanding the kind of the global urgency of pushing for Palestinian equal rights within the context in which one resides. That's the first part. The second is being able to kind of understand and communicate with the conditions on the ground in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, facilitated, of course, by social media, by the internet, first of all, provided more content, more accessible content over time, and by social media. So mobilization is more possible now. So these are some of the I think the highlight in terms of without Palestinians living in transnational spaces, I would be very doubtful that this would be as successful as it is today in terms of the changing, or as let's say, the changing discourse around Palestine would be as powerful as it is today. So I think they have played an extremely significant role in interpreting and reframing and kind of speaking and representing the question of Palestine in ways that had not been seen easily in the past. Now, this isn't to say, I also want to say, Nasim, if I may, this isn't to say that advocacy for Palestine didn't exist before the invention of the internet, per se.
Mm.
Advocacy for Palestine has existed. It's just that when people were advocating for Palestine, these messages would fall on ears that don't have a framework to fully understand it. And by that, I mean there needed to be transformations and changes that had taken place in the context of the US, and I think globally in general, around equity, around conversations of various conversations. I'm happy to get into the details of it. That change needed to happen in order for the message to really um, uh, get some sort of salience effectively. We'll have
So
some.
I guess one of the you mentioned a number of structural processes that took place over the past few decades, which allowed the Palestinian issue to become centered, and there was far greater, I would say, American attention on the Palestinian issue.
Mhm,
One of the things we're seeing in the US now is the Mamdani effect, in the sense here he's someone who's bypassed all traditional gatekeepers to
mhm,
emerge as a formidable, opponent to not just the Republican but also the Democrats. He's probably presenting a model of how to win elections in the post-Gaza genocide arena, where social media, where TikTok or where Instagram, these short videos are grabbing the attention, which otherwise in the previous decades would have been captured by your mainstream media. The
mhm,
Palestinian issue has bypassed that. And you speak about some of these structural changes that have taken place. Social media is one, which has allowed the Palestinian issue to become centered, to become at the forefront,
mhm.
to grab the attention of Americans and people in the West in general. So, what are some of the other structural processes other than just social media that have shaped that have has had a massive impact on Palestinian issue grabbing the attention it is at the moment?
Wonderful. I mean, I think yes, absolutely. I mean, Zohran Mamdani's situation and kind of his campaign really speaks to the current moment in American society. That there are a lot of people who actually have issues with the already established political organizations, political institution, and that effectively is one of the major issues here. So, in uh, one of the events that I mentioned earlier was the World Trade Organization protest in Seattle in 1999. Now, that moment really started the conversation of the level of violence that the police use against people and the idea of the militarization of the police. Increasingly after that moment, the police stations started acquiring more weapons that are handed down from the military. And that program had existed for a while, but it accelerated after, the World Trade Organization events, and more so after 9/11, soon after, a couple of years after that. So that led effectively to people recognizing that the state in the United, I mean, here we're talking only obviously about the United States specifically, recognize that the state itself, kind of the government, the state apparatus, is one that doesn't necessarily think of the individual as valuable as individuals had thought of themselves, right? You ended up over time, and I'm happy to discuss the details. But over time, about a decade or so, you had a level of polarization that had taken place in American society, where you have um, between the state and Americans. They saw a kind of a growing disconnect, if I may. And this isn't necessarily on the left per se. I mean, you can think about the World Trade Organization, people who attribute to be against free trade and thinking about fair trade to be ones on social justice. So that's one part of it. So, and social justice, and I'm talking about the leftist politics. That's one thing. But then you also had conservatives in the United States who are also have had issues with the U.S. government and that disconnect, effectively, that I've been talking about. Particularly, if you are to talk about a decade later, in particular, you had the Occupy movement, which is kind of class-based effort pushing against the 1% who continue to get richer in the United States at the expense of everybody else. So that was one part. Again, they are more aligned with the left. But on the right, you had the what is known as the Tea Party. I mean, there's that tradition of thinking about the Tea Party and what it signified to American society as kind of being disconnected from England and being able to kind of go on its own and so on. So you find that disconnect between state and society, regardless of where you stand politically, to be quite powerful. To this day, in fact. And I think a lot of people have made the argument that Trump's win is part of those kind of changes that are taking place. So that was the first factor. The second factor, in addition to this, has to do primarily with new and renewed definitions of equity and equality in the United States, in particular with the Black Lives Matter movement, creating the space for people to understand, in new terms that equity is one that, in a sense, comes with no preconditions, effectively, right? And I think this is part of the transformation that are taking place. That you notice now, younger people fully understand the question of Palestine because they understand that lens quite well. In the United States, we had also multiple campaigns against people of Asian descent. So there's a hashtag End Asian Hate, and the campaign for End Asian Hate was also quite powerful in kind of pushing against racialization and dehumanization. So the idea of dehumanization, or an Orientalism in the case of Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians, is understood now. I mean, people have things in their minds, and by people I mean, and I hate to use the everyday American, right? But someone who is not necessarily connected to the region understands effectively what it means to be racialized. What does it mean that some people get racialized because of their racial, ethnic, religious identity, and much of it can potentially be wrong. Okay, so that to me alone really kind of provided a new landscape, or a new kind of terrain, if I may, for people to understand the question of Palestine better. So these are some of the issues that I've talked about and discussed. And I also look, we can talk about social media as an important factor, but to me, social media just provided a platform. It's kind of the piazza, effectively. It's the place where people gathered and were able to find each other and mobilize. But so it had kind of an intervening effect, but not necessarily a central piece of effect. It had been used, I think, social media in effective ways, but also it's also kind of a platform where fights also take place, where people push against each other's ideas, obviously. So these are some of the kind of major factors that are taking place. And again, all throughout this time, I also want to mention in terms of Black Lives Matter and organizing at the local level, Palestinians were always there. I mean, like the Black Lives Matter movement was also kind of spearheaded by some Palestinian leaders in the United States, who've worked to push against the oppression faced by Black people in the United States. So Palestinians were there. Palestinians are part of the fabric of organizing in the United States, and that has played a role in kind of creating those bonds necessary to to kind of creating the bonds individually, but also between communities, allowing other communities to understand the question and apply to the Palestinians in ways that they hadn't previously.
So the intersectionality you're mentioning, of course, has been really
Sure.
crucial to the building of alliances to advance the Palestinian cause. And the way I look at it also is that there is another structural shift, or a broad realization within the US, which inadvertently has impacted the way Americans see the Palestinian issue, um, which is that even those who, on the right, the Republicans, people like Trump, who claim to be America first, but ultimately, even they have shown when it comes um, that is the only consistency or the only constant in the U.S. Well, one of the many constant, one of the constant in the U.S. In U.S. politics is that Israel first is a principle in U.S. politics, and I think that realization is much clearer now than it was, say, 5 years ago, even or 10 years ago, and I think that shift, which Palestinians, of course, had no uh, influence over or had played no part in, you know, in exposing this, has, I think, created another structural shift in American politics. That even the Americans who previously would have had some sympathy to Israel, and now with the Gaza genocide taking place, there's a realization that, okay, Israel, why does Israel always get to be first? Why are Israeli priorities always um, valued more highly than priorities to do with safeguarding America, safeguarding American citizens? So that realization, so I guess the question I want to ask is, what role has that realization played in centering the Palestinian issue more than it was previously?
Absolutely. I mean, this realization is the change we're talking about. The change has already happened, and have seen the early stages of that. That the realization of the right and the left, effectively, or people who aren't particularly, who don't see themselves on the spectrum at all politically, they also have started realizing this. And that is a product of what had taken place over the past 25 or 30 years. Now, why Israel first? I mean, politically, I mean, I'm going to try to kind of like provide a quick rationale here. There's always, in the context of the US, there's this cultural perception that Israel is, in fact, similar to America, right? Effectively seeing the two as interconnected, and the fate of Israel is the fate of Israel. I mean, the United States. And the fates of both countries are interconnected. Now, of course, that is being shattered, obviously, now. But it has to do with how American form of Protestant Christianity, and I'm generalizing here, unfortunately, but really specifically, I'm talking about the evangelical perception of that relationship, is one that comes kind of from a biblical prophecy that really kind of pushed forward by the likes of John Hagee to say that, if all of the kingdom of Israel is restored, then the return of the Messiah will be this kind of, that's a condition for the return of the Messiah. So in the sense that a lot of this conversation around biblical kind of connection between Christianity and Israel is one that has really made itself quite visible in American society, culture, and politics. But over time, as you've mentioned, this has completely changed. Now, why that change has taken place? It is simply because over the years, more knowledge, more awareness of the connections that have taken place between Israel and the United States are not necessarily favorable to the United States. I mean, as early as 2005, you find a book called The Israel Lobby that really came out that really pushed the argument that, look, U.S. foreign policy is one that has centered Israel, right or wrong, even when it's costly to the United States. And that really, I think, this is kind of one of many changes that are taking place, not only in the academy, but I think in overall larger society, that really took us to a place where we are now noticing that this change is even taking place in different spaces. I also want to say that these types of arguments of the connection between Israel and the United States around that biblical piece are easily kind of refuted by the fact that there are Palestinian Christians in Palestine who are also affected by Israeli occupation. And I think when Christians in the United States hear that, they would want to know more. And ultimately, that path leads them to conclusions that they didn't previously have. So I think this is one thing. And
Just
look,
hold that thought. To
yeah,
add to
please.
that, I've also noticed recently that there's a real pushback against the idea of Christian Zionism. There are
Mhm,
now many podcasters who openly have debates with evangelical Christians, and the conclusion they've come to, those who criticize evangelical Christians, they'll say, this is actually heresy. That there is no Christian theological foundation which demands you to commit your support to Israel. This is
mhm.
complete heresy from a Christian point of view. So you can have political loyalties, that's different. But to argue that there's some key theological position which demands your loyalty or support, you give support to Israel, this is
Mhm.
heresy. And I'm seeing more and more of that in the new spaces in social media, in the podcast world, and debates every week. So that's another I would say development that's taking place to break up this idea that evangelical Christian is rooted, well, support for Israel is rooted in Christianity. I think this is being debunked now.
100%. I totally agree with you, especially this change that is taking place within the religious spaces, conservative spaces, and politically on the kind of, if we're talking about let's say, again, generalizing, not every Republican is someone who attributes to these ideas, but within the Republican space as well, because I think this is a lot of the base of the Republican Party, obviously, is rooted in the evangelical Christian right that has really dominated a lot of those conversations. And when that fracture is taking place, I don't want to call it fracture, but change. Let's call it a change that is taking place, and kind of breaking off from the past in terms of ideas in relation to Israel and Palestine, is one that is talked about differently now. And I think, I mean, look, you mentioned earlier that this book is optimistic. I mean, I think I I I would want to revise that if I may. I am a pessimist, more or less. I think most social scientists are, I suspect. But I think there is a reason why within the Democratic Party there is Democrats for Israel as an institution that has emerged. It didn't come out of nowhere, as I kind of mentioned that somewhere in the book, where the fact that there's the Democratic Party feels, and not necessarily all the Democratic Party, but some factions within the Democratic Party feel that they need to reaffirm and renew the commitment of the Democratic Party to quote unquote security of Israel and so on and so forth, and to be on the side of Israel when needed because it's our greatest ally, for example. Um, it this sort of an institution emerges out of necessity. It emerges out of the feeling that we must do this, right? So when we read into certain events, we see them at times as, oh, the Democratic Party is renewing yet again their commitment to Israel. But the reason why they need to renew their commitment is a function of this change we are noticing. They're trying to kind of counter that effect effectively that is taking place. And I don't think that this cannot be kind of overlooked, there's a reason why um, there's a reason why the mainstream pushes back against any alternative story related to Palestine and Israel because it's the mainstream, and ultimately, when you push the mainstream is going to push back. And I use that term mainstream to kind of talk about mainstream news organizations, mainstream State Department of the United States in terms of how they talk and mention Palestine and or Israel. So effectively, there is a change that's on the horizon. And when we notice the kind of the doubling down effectively of the already existing powers, the traditional powers and the traditional kind of the traditional current that quote unquote reaffirms the commitment to Israel and so on, whatever that means, right? It means that it's actually kind of responding to the current crisis. There's a crisis that they're dealing with. So, am I an optimist? I think, and I'm an optimist in the long term. I mean, I think it's in the current historical moment that we're living through. There's a genocide. There's a genocide that is taking place that is relentless, that is being politically and diplomatically supported by a lot of the Western countries, particularly the United States. More ammunition are being sent to Israel as we speak, you know. So these types of things will continue to happen, and obviously that's a terrible thing that is taking place, morally speaking, and every way you look at it. But I also think that that although that is happening, we are noticing changes that are taking place. I'm sure you've seen in more recent weeks the changing kind of public opinion in the United States around sympathy towards Palestinians and Israelis. And for the first time ever, about, I would say, 8 weeks or so, well, maybe 6 weeks ago, for the first time ever, American sympathy, American public sympathy towards Palestinians surpassed that of sympathy towards Israelis. And this is astonishing, to be honest. I mean, I kind of predicted that we're moving in that direction when I wrote the book. And the book, as you know, doesn't particularly deal with October 7th at all. I mean, I'm talking about the changes that have led to something like October 7th. And I think in some ways it was predictable because the intensity of the violence against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank is paralleled and mirrored in some ways in terms of how the fight around Palestine and Israel in the United States will take place. The more intense the fight there is, the more intense the fight will be here. But ultimately, the context here is different. When we talk about the United States, we're not talking about an easily controllable place by the Israeli government, one would suspect. There's more kind of variables, more things that are taking place, especially when American society is now more able to define equity, to include Palestinians, to understand the plight of the Palestinians in ways that they never understood before. And again, it's just simply all of those factors needed to take place all at once. I mean, the three sets of factors that I mentioned, of course, you know, Palestinians living in diaspora, this condition, the calamity of Palestinians creating opportunities in the long term, and the fact that Palestinians in Palestine living under Israeli occupation asked the rest of the world for help. So that's Palestine specific type of a variable that it took place that really over decades. And then the second is kind of the changes that have taken place in the United States, particularly and kind of the emergence of the internet creating a newer way to speak and talk and discuss issues related to social justice. And another thing I want to mention here is that this younger generation, I mean, it's age specific, but it's also not necessarily age specific. And by that I mean, like, you know, you've always had someone who understood the conversation of Palestine in decades past, but it's much more um, in terms of the mass, in terms of the critical mass that we're witnessing today. You have a lot more younger generational divide. In the generational divide, you find more younger people understanding the question in Palestine so easily in ways that their parents never were able to understand. And a young,
That's the optimism I'm talking about. That's the
absolutely, yep.
optimism a lot of these polls, highlight. And I think you're right. I think there is, of course, we are in this critical moment where, despite the genocide, there seems to be a demand for commitment to Israel,
Mhm.
even though Israel is committing genocide. And I think many Democrats are on in this position where they have to recommit to Israel despite the genocide, and I think and we're seeing the backlash of the fact that there is a growing number of Americans, a growing number of people in the West who, as Norman Finkelstein would say, know too much. People actually now know too much about Israel, about Israel's creation, about the human rights abuses taking place on the ground, about the genocide in Gaza right now. And I think too many Americans now have their identity wedded to the Palestinian cause, and that's the reality we're in. And because of that, there's a huge backlash legally and in many other ways. And legally, as you know, in the US, there's attempts to
Criminals,
proscribe the
yeah.
BDS organization. In the UK, just this week, our government has proscribed Palestine Action. This is a peaceful movement which has been designated as a terrorist group like ISIS or Al Qaeda. This is the situation we're in. There is now a pushback by the establishment on both
Mhm.
sides of the Atlantic because of people knowing too much, people engaging in direct action. But the legal sphere, you talk about that in your book. I mean, the legal sphere has become now a major battleground, for the advocates of Israel and also those who oppose Israel's genocide. So, do you want to speak just a little bit about the battle over the legal space before kind of conclude our conversation?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the most critical conversations that's is happening as it's taking place in the US and I'm sure elsewhere. Um, there are laws against BDS, as you've mentioned, in almost virtually the vast majority of states in the US, state laws, um, to the point where it has become kind of infringed upon, the freedom of speech of Americans. The ability to boycott as has always been seen as a right. That's something that Americans would have. But that's being challenged, obviously, by the legal kind of within the legal sphere. So this is I think exemplifies the fight around Palestine, because then the only course of action that would have to be taken would be the court, and the court system effectively will ultimately kind of decide whether this is possible or not. Look, in the United States, if people who have no connection to Palestine and or Israel care about their freedom of speech, their due process, the legal foundations of their liberties, and so on, Palestine now is at the very heart of it. One cannot preserve freedom of speech if one does not advocate for Palestinian equal rights and Palestinian ability to speak about Palestine freely, and ability of critics of Israel to speak freely about this. To criminalize speech and dub it as anti-Semitic, for example, is another legal battle that is being taking place. Oftentimes, everything is dubbed within the anti-Semitic conversation that a critique of the state of Israel is one that is anti-Semitic inherently anti-Semitic by definition. But what's interesting is that there are growing numbers of Jewish Americans, organizations, and individuals. And again, and I'm not necessarily talking about the United States specifically, that's a global phenomenon. You find different Jewish communities pushing against this narrative to say that their Jewish identity is not one that is connected to the state of Israel. And the definitions of Zionism can vary. And it's not only the manifestation of Zionism in the kind of the image of the state of Israel. So I think a lot of those things are happening all at once, in particular with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of what anti-Semitism is. That includes any manifestation of self-determination of the Jewish people. And of course, that has been used and hijacked to suggest that Israel is a manifestation of that. So any critique of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic. And I also want to mention that one of the authors of this particular definition himself says
Ken Stone.
Stein, yeah, Stern, that's right, who basically says that this is a not necessarily the definition that was thought of to be in terms of critique of Israel, to be seen as inherently anti-Semitic, but it was weaponized. It has become quite weaponized. And I think, one case at a time, you notice that is being struck down effectively in different contexts. And legal battles take time, and there's the legislature battle that is taking place. There's the legal battle that is taking place. There's the law. But then ultimately, there's also a cultural shift. We are ongoing. It's kind of cultural shifts aren't easy. It takes time. There's a critical mass component to this. And I don't necessarily want to idealize people on the internet, or on social media or Instagram, but there's something very powerful about someone from the mainstream talking about and discussing things that are taking place in Gaza and taking a moral stand against those actions that are taking place, against the genocide, against the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, against starving of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and against Israeli settler violence in the West Bank. There is something quite powerful about that, because it really over time has the potential of changing the entire political calculus associated with kind of standing along the state of Israel and its policies. There's a moment where policy will have to follow public opinion, and that might happen sooner than later, especially that we're noticing that a lot of the candidates who are getting into the political sphere, regardless of what level, mayoral level, as we know in New York City, to state legislature level, to national levels in terms of Congress, you notice that the issue of Palestine is at the heart of it, and people must take a decision, must take a position, and make a decision in terms of whether they're going to do, whether they're going to listen to their base, whether they're going to respond to the needs and kind of the changing demographics and politics of their constituents, or are they going to take the line of the political party? And we know one thing, that ultimately, doesn't matter how long it takes, politicians come and go, governments come and go, but people remain and ideas will remain. So I really believe in the future because it's still not necessarily defined. And any attempt to define the case, the issue of Palestine, any attempt to define it in ways that is favorable to Israel is not going to hold anymore.
Mm.
And
So
every time, yeah, please.
yeah, so I wanted to just make a final observation and end, and if you want to come back on that, you can. So you quote Noura Arakat in your book, and she has a really interesting quote there where she says that we need to lift buried histories, imagine alternative futures. And I think where we are at the moment, you spoke about Orientalism. There was a time when the Palestinian cause was very much presented by pro-Israeli lobbyists and pro-Israeli groups as being on the side of barbarism, being on the side of Islamism or Islamic extremism. And they still do, they pit the Palestinian cause as a cause against civilization versus barbarism. And we have that all the time. And I think more and more people are or less and less people are believing in this narrative, and that now we are in a situation where I think um, the Palestinian, as your book says, stand with Palestine. I think to stand with Palestine means to stand with people who are opposed to genocide, to stand with people who oppose apartheid, to stand with people who are against racism. So we are seeing a massive shift from a time when to stand with Palestine meant to stand with, in the eyes of the American public, Arab backwardness, this kind of Oriental trope. But now we are in a situation where the majority of the Americans view the Palestinian issue as standing for, against genocide, against apartheid, against human rights abuse, and against Israeli influence and sway in America. And I think that's the battle which the Israelis can never win. When to stand with Palestine means all those positive things, and which is what it is in the eyes of most Americans. And so I don't think that's something which the Israelis can ever overcome. So just your final thoughts on that before we conclude.
No, I think you summarized it quite well. I think today, when people stand for Palestine, they're standing for justice, they're standing for equality, they're standing for social justice in a way that they haven't previously, because now there's more inclusive ways to think about oppressed peoples, and then in addition to this, you know. Israel isn't particularly seen in a positive light anymore. It has for a long time, but now it hasn't. And any attempt to erase Palestinian identity over the decades that have passed, 77 years and counting, it only backfired for Israel. So oftentimes, the intentional neglect of mentioning the word Palestine, in fact, highlights the word Palestine, highlights the Palestinian cause. Every time Israel is mentioned, to replace Palestine, every time the replacing of the cultural, the kind of geographical location of Palestinians with the word Israel, the more you're highlighting the elephant in the room, effectively, the Palestinians. So uh, Palestinian erasure isn't going to happen. We know that. And any attempt to suppress the efforts of Palestinians who are calling for equal rights will be subject to addressing all other social justice issues, and there's no way around it. So I feel, in some ways, despite, as you've mentioned, despite the difficult circumstances we're living through, despite the genocide, there will be a future where Palestine will be centered as the ultimate case for one's very own humanity, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of where social justice will be evaluated. And I think where one's position on Palestine determines determines their not only their politics, but I think the way they see the future and they see their own communities.
Thank you, Karam. That was Karam Dana, author of To Stand with Palestine, Transnational Resistance and Political Evolution in the United States. Do buy his book. It came out, I think, just earlier in 2000, this year, just a few months ago,
Yeah.
February, I think, this year. Thank you so much. And thank you also for tuning in. And I hope to see you for another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Nasim. Thank you for having me.